time in the private rented sector. I'm with the lovely Kate Faulkner. We're in London. We've come up today because there is a private reception at the House of Commons to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the RLA, which we're attending a bit later. But of course, Kate, being one of the country's top property commentators, is the ideal person to talk about the new private rented sector report that's been issued by the University of York. And Kate, we were really looking forward to this report coming out, weren't we? Because it's the lovely Dr. Julie Rugg, very well known for her work, and also David Rhodes worked together on this report. And well, it's so great to hear some common sense.
It is, and this is a report which is 208 pages. For somebody like me, it's an absolute joy to read. And I think the two reasons is firstly, we have proper statistics that are up to date on the private rented sector that have been looked at, reviewed, scrutinised by academics that know what they're doing. So I dabble, but these guys are absolute experts. So we now have a real good understanding of a lot of the statistics now in the private rented sector that are chatted about regularly. The second thing is, I think that it's gone out with no agenda. What they wanted to do was get an understanding of where the private rented sector is today, just like they did back in 2008, 10 years ago, when we saw the last report. And what this report does now is it gives everybody, wherever you are or whatever your involvement in the private rented sector, a much better understanding of where we are now, where we've perhaps gone wrong, and some of the things that we perhaps should be changing to get this right in the future. Because none of us in the private rented sector want to wake up every morning to unhappy headlines.
Quite.
And I think that's how, certainly if you're a landlord or letting agent, that's kind of how you feel.
Well, it's certainly created a great talking point. It's had extensive media coverage, which is only a good thing. But I think, you know, one of the overarching themes of the report is it does criticise successive governments' housing policies, actually, you know, making things worse because they have all these knock-on effects and collateral damage which they didn't really think about when they were putting these policies into place. So very much good for us as a talking point, and then to use the statistics that you mentioned.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, nobody introduces or spends time introducing a law because they think they're going to make things worse. But there is this horrible phrase, although I quite like it, of unintended consequences. And the reason I quite like it is because if you introduce a law, people react in a certain way. And what I thought Julie explained very well yesterday was that each of those individual laws that have been introduced, landlords have responded in a certain way, and unfortunately, overall, what it hasn't done was what everybody wanted it to do, was make things necessarily better for tenants. And actually, we all want to do that. So I think that the real call yesterday was the first thing we need is a proper strategy for the private rented sector. And one of the questions that I asked, because it's still a question in my mind, is should we be putting vulnerable people and those on housing benefit in the private rented sector? Because the private rented sector is often accused of not treating them properly. But I don't think it was ever set up for that. And now we've got 1 million people on council waiting lists. We aren't building the social homes. But in some local authorities, so I've rented to people on housing benefit in the past, and actually the local authority was brilliant. They had a great little system, and they saw my safety certificates, and they checked and photos of the property. I chose tenants applied, and then they came round to see the property, and I chose the tenant. I don't understand why that isn't required for anybody on housing benefit. And if I'm a landlord, am I really the right person to be looking after somebody who's gone through domestic abuse, who's an asylum seeker? Some landlords might be, but we need to really understand who is the private, what do we want as a country from the private rented sector, rather than just hitting out at the kind of what I call the soldiers on the front line, the letting agents and the landlords, that they're not doing a good enough job. And then introducing all these itty-bitty laws, which are coming so fast and furious, no real money for enforcement, so that means that all the bad guys are still operating, and tenants are kind of no better off, and they should be.
And indeed, you know, at the you went to a very high-level government steering committee meeting today, earlier in London, And one thing that Dr. Rugg was very keen to get across was that they're not rogue landlords, they're criminal landlords.
Yeah, these are people who are trafficking.
Yeah.
You know, they're bringing people over here who they're putting in slum conditions and then sending them out to work or doing whatever they're doing with them. And that is just a horrific situation for anybody to be in, and it is criminal. So I think Newham have been quite good at doing work on this and working with the police, etc. But we do have to understand, and I think again that's where Julie was very good and David have done all this really hard work, is they've redefined who the individual landlords are and kind of redefined who the tenants are as well. So they're being very clear about who's supplying the properties and why, and who are actually using the properties and how they feel about those properties. Most of which most people are happy, but then they feel that the other thing that came out was the bar wasn't very high in the first place.
Yeah.
Which, if you're somebody who's renting at £2,000 a month, that bar's really high.
Yeah.
And, you know, as a letting agent landlord, you'll be working your socks off for them. But you know what? The really sad thing I think that came out of this is how much other departments are impacting on the private rented sector. For example, all the wealth reforms that have come in, that has made it pretty difficult for people on housing benefit, and especially those that are vulnerable, to live in the private rented sector. Not necessarily the fault of the landlord or indeed the letting agent. And we need to work together to do a much better job for them, or say, do you know what, there are some people that just must have social housing and have that care and support and all of the other things that they need around them that a private landlord can't necessarily deliver.
Indeed. And what were the other kind of key topics that came up at your meeting this morning?
So I think the main themes were that we needed to understand the market even better than the report shows. So it was very interesting on letting agents, for example. Dr. Julie Rugg was saying we don't actually know enough about how letting agents really work. So there was a comment saying that they don't necessarily automatically improve the market, but as you and I know, there's letting agents who do a great job, and there's ones, because anybody can set up themselves as a letting agent, who don't. But she was very much calling for more research actually on the letting agent industry and how it worked, and therefore how we should kind of regulate it into the future. And I think the other thing that really is as well, things like affordability. We're often, the industry is often accused of extortionate rents and skyrocketing rents.
Yes, all these emotive words
absolutely
bandied around by the likes of
I don't know if we can do this, but maybe if we can put some of the charts up to link to from the report. Certainly the affordability side in the regions, from a tenant's perspective, was pretty good. And certainly when you look at tenant arrears, it's pretty low as well. So the rental sector is affordable for a lot of people. Where it becomes very difficult is if you are on welfare and you're in London. And so there are pockets of areas and some people that are really struggling in the private rented sector. And that's not necessarily because the landlord's been greedy. They might be mistreating them because they're in the criminal element. But we need to find, you know, an alternative way of looking after those people, because they're trapped in a world where if they get into rent arrears, they're in all sorts of trouble. And that sector very much needs, really, that I took out of this huge support network around it. And if you put people in the private rented sector as opposed to in a social environment, how do we make sure they still get looked after and access to that?
No, I totally get that.
And in some areas, we know that landlords can't actually deliver social or housing to people on benefits and that, because that area has been so squeezed so much by sort of DWP and the introduction of universal credit, and not necessarily thought through all the impact that would have on housing for these people. And we have to be much more joined up. There are something like 6 or 7 departments involved in the private rented sector, have an impact on it, and they don't necessarily talk to each other before they make their decisions. So it doesn't matter if you're in government, doesn't matter if you're a landlord, a letting agent, a mortgage lender, an insurance company working in this sector, or indeed the tenant groups. Do you know what? We've all got to do a better job And the best way of doing that is we've got to sit around a table and with these stats, which now to me set the standard, if you like, just say, well, this is the real situation. Now, how do we make it better?
No, I think that's such a positive kind of starting point because, you know, you've just mentioned a very niche section of the demographic who are the tenants who are on welfare, on housing benefit or universal credit in London and the South East, but then measures are brought in that affect everybody else, like you mentioned, this collateral damage, and I think identifying those tenant groups and creating legislation specifically to support them is a lot healthier than this kind of blanket approach that we've seen. And I think one of the other things that has come out of this report that is gaining quite a bit of traction, and also with landlords themselves, and this is this idea of a kind of annual property MOT.
Yeah,
and
I love the idea.
I quite like this idea because it just brings together all the different strands of compliance and regulation. And it's so simple, and this is definitely a possible way forward.
Do you know what? Mark Easton, who's in the BBC that was chairing this event, he came up with what I thought was a brilliant phrase. He said, why do you call it a private rented sector? Why don't you call it people requiring security? And I thought, actually replacing private with people in some way, so we could have some suggestions from everybody of what we could rename the PRS, because I thought it is about people. And our first job as an industry is to make sure that every property that is let is done so legally and safely.
Yep.
Well, that's the job of putting a car on the road. And how do we make sure, what's a tried, tested way of doing it? You have your MOT, and then you have to apply for your insurance. And you can't get your insurance without the MOT. And why don't we apply the same principle? There's lots of fears and worries about it costing extra, etc. But do you know what? If you make sure the property's okay, do you need to worry about licensing? Do you need to worry about all the other quite huge costs that have been put on landlords? Maybe you just get them to register. Maybe you get them then to pay for their MOT, and then they can go and get their insurance. And that system can probably be delivered a lot more simply and a lot more cost effectively than some of the costs at the moment. Because the problem is, once somebody's in a bad property, with a bad landlord added potentially to that, the costs of sorting that situation out to local authorities who can't afford really to do it without charging fortunes on licensing fees, then that's where we're going. I think we're going wrong. Let's stop the properties coming on, bad properties coming onto the market in the first place, and make it easy for tenants, landlords, letting agents, mortgage companies, insurance companies, because they are part of this discussion, that we deliver a safe property for people to live in. If we can do that and do that at a reasonable cost, then that's better than HHSRS and all of the other enforcement you have to do. You're still going to have to do enforcement, but if we can focus that on criminal activity, that's a much better way of doing it.
I think there's a lot more to come out of this report, Kate.
Definitely.
As you mentioned. It's how long, how many pages?
208 pages, I believe. I'm sure a few of those are appendices and acknowledgements, but I will be going with it in great detail. So if it's helpful, I'll perhaps pull out some of the things that I think these are the things not to miss. Because this genuinely is a report that I hope is a real game changer. And I hope whether you're, as I say, government, mortgage lender, insurance company, letting agent, landlord and tenant groups, please, let's all get behind what is a properly produced report with correct stats, and let's find a way to make sure that in 5 years' time, everybody, as much as we can, is living in a great property with a lovely roof over their head. Yeah,
totally agree. And I think you've mentioned it's a game changer. I think it could be a turning point for the private rented sector. We've got a new housing minister who is making a lot of interesting, positive noises. And I really hope that this RUG report that we're talking about here today, that it kind of brings everybody to much more together and all singing from the same hymn sheet, because when we do that, then we can actually achieve something.
Yeah, and to be fair, you know, the whole thing couldn't have happened without the financial support of the Nationwide Foundation, and that was the chairman's call at the end, was very much let's work together.
Oh, okay.
And let's not keep kind of throwing stones at each other, because that's not working. We're not going to do the best job we can. Our job is to really care for tenants and make sure that landlords can deliver. And the best way we do that is all by sitting around a table and finding solutions to what are all the identified problems with the majority of the stats that we need, albeit there's some more work to do, but I think that'll get done as well. We've got everything we need now, so there's kind of, to everybody, I'd say, no excuses now. We can make this better in the next 5 years, but we have to work together.
Indeed. So we'd like to thank Dr. Julie Rugg and also David Rhodes.
Yeah, they have worked
for their
very
hard work. As you mentioned, the Nationwide Foundation as well for sponsoring the report. And do join the conversation and share your views on the findings of this report. I think that the more people that are engaged with it, the more landlords, everybody within the sector, I think the more people that we can get engaged with it, we can actually use this report as a starting point and push forward in a much more positive way. Absolutely, and just make it a sector that everybody can enjoy working in and do a good job, because I genuinely don't believe anybody in this sector gets up to make people's lives miserable. Let's make sure that everybody can, if we enjoy the sector and everybody enjoys working in it, we'll do a better job for the tenants that we serve. Absolutely. Kate, so great to have your insights into this. You've been in the thick of it. Absolutely. And, I've been very sleepless nights waiting for my data and all the thoughts that come out of it. So very exciting. And to hear your insights from the actual meeting this morning as well, absolutely fantastic. So thank you as ever for being such a great communicator about private rented sector issues and for being part of the conversation on property trials. But what we've got to do is come up with a better word, a better phrase in private rented sector. And P has to stand for people. I like that. I really like that. Well, so, the challenge is out there. Over to you. Over to you.